Welcome back to the Grave of the Shadows. Before we begin, a huge thanks for your support. If you love the mystery, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell. Now, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's chilling tale. In the winter of 1887, beneath the shadow of Queen Victoria's ever-expanding empire, a series of murders began to unravel in the heart of London, one that would haunt the streets for years to come. As the city stood draped in a thick fog, an eerie, unsettling sensation took hold, a feeling that something dark and unfathomable was creeping through the fog, lurking in plain sight. A killer, but not just any killer. This one was different. It wasn't the bloodshed that made these crimes so chilling, nor was it the brutality that accompanied each murder. It was the manner in which the victims died. Each corpse was found with an unnerving expression etched across their faces, a twisted, frozen smile. The kind of smile that one might expect to see on the face of someone who had died laughing. But there was something even more haunting, something that would send shivers down the spine of anyone daring to investigate. Long after the victims had passed, their laughter, genuine, full-bodied, and eerily vibrant, echoed from their homes. Witnesses, neighbors, and even police officers swore they heard the haunting sound hours after the bodies were confirmed dead. No one could explain it. The police surgeon could find no physical cause for the peculiar sounds, no signs of life, yet the laughter persisted, leaving an unsettling trace behind. For nearly a year, the case would baffle even the most seasoned investigators at Scotland Yard. The case file was sealed away, hidden from public view, tucked into the darkest corners of the archives, where it would remain for over 90 years. But why? What was it about this case that was so important, so dangerous, that it had to be kept in the shadows? The answer was simple. This wasn't just the work of a madman. The truth was far more sinister, far more calculated. The victims, all prominent members of London's elite, were connected in ways no one could have imagined. And behind the murders stood not a random killer, but someone far more intelligent, far more methodical, and far more terrifying than anyone could have anticipated. But before we dive deeper into this tale of murder, intrigue, and deception, take a moment to consider this. How far would the powerful members of society go to protect their reputations? What lengths would they take to hide the most twisted of secrets? London, 1887, was the heart of an empire that spanned the globe, a time when gas lamps illuminated cobblestone streets and horse-drawn carriages still carried the elite through the fog. The wealthy, the powerful, and the aristocratic lived in carefully guarded mansions in the affluent Belgravia district, their lives sheltered from the gritty reality of the slums. Life in this part of London was one of comfort and luxury. But beneath the surface, beneath the polished facades and the grand dinner parties, darkness was taking root. For the city's elite, London's fog was not just a natural occurrence. It was a symbol of the unseen, of things hidden in plain sight, the perfect veil for the crimes that unfolded in the dead of night. As each murder unfolded, it became increasingly clear that this wasn't a simple spree of violence. There was a pattern. There was a purpose. A message. In the midst of this storm of mystery and fear stood Inspector Edmund Harwick, a man whose name would soon be etched into the annals of crime history. Known for his sharp mind and his ability to navigate both the seedy underbelly of London streets and the elite drawing rooms, Harwick was a man with a reputation. But he would need more than just his usual detective skills to crack this case. He would need to understand the mind of the killer, a mind that was unlike anything he had encountered before. The first victim was discovered in Belgravia, where the air hung heavy with secrets and wealth. Lady Margaret Harrington, a prominent figure in society, returned home one fateful night to find her housekeeper, Mrs. Whitfield, dead on the floor, her face frozen in a smile so unnerving that it seemed as though the woman had died mid-laughter. The house was in chaos, furniture overturned, a vase shattered, and a trail of mystery leading deeper into the unknown. This was only the beginning. As Harwick delved deeper into the case, he would uncover a web of deceit, obsession, and madness that would take him to the darkest corners of London's high society. The killer was no ordinary murderer. He was a man driven by a philosophy that only he understood, a philosophy that would shake the very foundations of the Victorian social order. But the question remained, who was this killer? Why were the victims chosen? And what did their deaths truly mean? As we step into the foggy streets of Victorian London, prepare yourself for a journey that will uncover not just the identity of the Laughing Man, but the chilling motives that led him to commit the most horrifying crimes the city had ever known. London in 1887 was more than just the capital of an empire. It was the very heartbeat of a world that stretched from the salt mines of Africa to the tea plantations of India. Queen Victoria's reign had entered its golden years, a time of celebration, expansion, and pomp. The streets of the city were a blend of history and modernity, where gas lamps flickered beside newly erected Victorian mansions, casting shadows across a city that never seemed to sleep. But there was more to London than its grand parades and industrial achievements. Beneath the surface of this bustling metropolis, there were secrets. Hidden within the labyrinth of cobblestone streets and towering buildings was a city divided. On one side, the privileged elite lived in opulent homes, shielded by gates, private servants, and the ever-watchful eyes of their high society peers. On the other, the poor slums of Whitechapel and beyond festered, where the air was thick with the stench of industry and the sound of horse-drawn carts clattering over uneven roads. Belgravia, the district where the murders would unfold, was a stark contrast to these poorer neighborhoods. This was where the new wealth of the Industrial Revolution had settled railroad barons, shipping magnates, and factory owners who had built their fortunes on the backs of a labor force they would rarely, if ever, acknowledge. The townhouses were like miniature palaces, adorned with iron balconies and pristine front gardens. Behind their walls, grand dinner parties were hosted by those who controlled the flow of the empire's riches. But as glamorous as this world appeared, there was an unsettling edge. The fog, characteristic of London's winters, clung to the streets like a living thing, choking visibility and leaving a heavy weight in the air. On foggy nights, the city seemed to transform into something otherworldly, where even familiar faces became shadowy silhouettes and the streets felt endless. The gas lamps that lined the avenues could only penetrate the murk for a few feet before being swallowed by the creeping fog, leaving the city streets shrouded in an almost supernatural gloom. It was on nights like these that darkness could creep unnoticed into the lives of the elite. The city, with its facade of prosperity and order, became a place where the unseen thrived. Even the wealthiest citizens, behind their closed doors, could not escape the chill of the night, nor the unsettling feeling that something, somewhere, was wrong. The rich lived a life apart, hidden behind their servants, their locked doors, and their security measures. They prided themselves on their untouchable social status, believing that wealth could shield them from the cruelties of the world beyond their walls. But that sense of security, built on their privilege, was fatally misplaced. As the fog rolled in that winter, the city became a playground for shadows and secrets. The same thick mist that would have felt familiar to the inhabitants of the poor districts now cast a veil over the lives of London's most privileged families. To them, the fog seemed romantic, a perfect setting for a city bathed in wealth and power. But for the residents of Belgravia, the fog wasn't just a weather condition. It was an omen, an invisible force that masked the dangers lurking within their community. This is the world in which our story begins. A world where the city's grandest neighborhoods were about to become the hunting grounds for a killer who would exploit the very things the elite held dear: reputation, power, and the blind trust that their wealth would shield them from the darkness that crept through the fog. The first murder would set the stage for a crime unlike any other, one that not only shocked the upper crust of society but revealed the fragile, unspoken realities beneath the gilded surface. It would be a mystery that unraveled not just the lives of its victims, but also the hidden truths about the city that thought itself above reproach. The chilling cold of October 15th, 1887, settled over London like a heavy blanket, muffling the sounds of the city. As the clock struck midnight, the air grew thick with fog, a dense mist that seemed to press against the walls of every building and narrow alley. The streets, usually bustling with late-night revelers and the occasional carriage, were eerily quiet. Even the gas lamps, which cast their flickering light over the cobblestones, appeared dimmer than usual, swallowed by the fog's all-encompassing embrace. Lady Margaret Harrington, returning early from a charity gala at the Royal Opera House, had no way of knowing that her life, and the lives of many others, would change that night. She had left the event before the final act, citing a headache that had plagued her throughout the evening. In truth, the performance of Wagner's Ring Cycle had bored her senseless, and she longed for the comfort of her own home. The journey back to Belgravia had been longer than usual. The thick fog had reduced visibility to mere feet, forcing her driver to slow the horse-drawn carriage and navigate carefully through the obscured streets. They had made the journey countless times before, but tonight the streets seemed unfamiliar, like a maze that was shifting with every turn. When Lady Margaret's carriage finally pulled up to her townhouse, something felt off. The front door of her home stood ajar, just slightly, as if inviting her inside. This was highly unusual. Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper who had worked for the Harrington family for over 20 years, was known for her meticulousness. Never in all those years had she left a door unlocked, let alone standing open to the cold night air. A strange feeling settled over Lady Margaret as she stepped out of the carriage, her silk slippers clicking against the wet stone steps. She called out softly into the quiet night, "Mrs. Whitfield, are you well?" Her voice was swallowed by the fog, carrying far less than the confidence she tried to muster. She had noticed the strange openness of the door, but she hadn't expected anything more than a minor oversight. Perhaps Mrs. Whitfield had fallen ill, or maybe a servant had left the door open by mistake. But the moment she stepped inside, the air in the hallway felt different. Cold, still, unsettling. The warm light from the gas jets in the entrance hall flickered, casting long, dancing shadows along the polished marble floors. The faint smell of something medicinal, a scent she couldn't quite place, filled the air. It was then that Lady Margaret's eyes fell on the body of Mrs. Whitfield, sprawled in the center of the drawing room. Her head, usually pinned neatly in a bun, was arranged carefully around her face, almost as if someone had taken the time to arrange her hair with intention, rather than in haste. The woman's body was positioned with an eerie precision, as if for some macabre performance. Her hands, weathered from years of hard work, were folded across her chest in a mockery of a proper Christian burial. But it wasn't just the arrangement of her body that made Lady Margaret's stomach turn. It was the expression frozen on Mrs. Whitfield's face. Her mouth was open wide in a grin, a rapturous, twisted smile that made it seem as though she had died while witnessing some great amusement. Lady Margaret gasped. It was the kind of smile one might expect to see in a photograph of a comedian, but not on a dead woman's face. It was as if Mrs. Whitfield had been laughing in her final moments. A deep, genuine laugh. Yet there was no sound, no echo of joy in the stillness, just the lifeless body, the twisted grin, and the haunting silence that filled the room. Lady Margaret's heart raced as she looked around the room. Furniture was overturned. A valuable Chinese vase lay shattered near the fireplace, its pieces scattered like broken dreams across the room. Books from the mahogany shelves were scattered across the floor, as though someone had torn through them in a frenzy. Velvet curtains had been ripped down from one of the windows, and Lady Margaret's delicate porcelain figurines, each one carefully collected over the years, lay shattered among the cushions of the sofa. It was clear that there had been a struggle. But who could have done this? Who would kill the loyal Mrs. Whitfield, a woman who had served the Harringtons with such dedication? And what was the meaning of that sickening smile? It was in that moment, as Lady Margaret stood frozen in shock, that she heard something she couldn't explain. A laugh. At first, it was faint, as though it were coming from another room. But then it grew louder. A deep, guttural laugh that echoed through the hallway and seeped into the drawing room. It wasn't Mrs. Whitfield's laugh. No, this was something darker, something more menacing. The sound seemed to reverberate from the walls, from the very air itself. The laughter seemed endless, as though it could not be stopped, no matter what. Lady Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The house was silent again, save for the sound of her own pulse beating in her ears. She staggered back toward the door, her hands trembling. "What in God's name is happening?" she whispered to herself. Within moments, the police were called. The scene was a nightmare. Mrs. Whitfield's body, her twisted expression, the eerie laughter. But the most puzzling detail, the one that would keep Scotland Yard occupied for months, was the lack of any explanation for the strange sounds. For hours, no one could understand how the laughter could persist long after the housekeeper had died. this was only the beginning. The story of the Laughing Man had just begun to unfold, and with it, the terrifying reality that London's most powerful elite were being targeted by a killer with a twisted mind and an even darker purpose. The early morning fog still clung to the streets when Inspector Edmund Harwick arrived at the scene of the crime. The heavy, damp air made it seem as though the entire city was holding its breath. Harwick, tall and lean, moved with the deliberate confidence of a man who had spent 15 years solving the most perplexing of cases. He was no stranger to the dark side of London. His career had begun on the streets of Whitechapel, where the cries of the destitute and the blood-stained pavement were the constant backdrop of his early days as a constable. But Harwick had risen through the ranks, his sharp mind and steady demeanor earning him respect across Scotland Yard. He was known for his meticulous nature, for never allowing a single detail to slip through the cracks. His ability to piece together the smallest of clues and follow the trail where others saw only dead ends had made him one of the most trusted detectives in the force. But this case, this murder, was different. It had all the makings of something far more sinister, far more disturbing than anything he had ever encountered. As Harwick stepped into the grand hallway of the Harrington residence, he surveyed the scene with an air of quiet professionalism. The house was as beautiful as it was unsettling. Its polished marble floors and exquisite furnishings stood in stark contrast to the chaos that had been left behind. There was no question that this was no ordinary crime. Lady Margaret had been shaken to her core, but Harwick's gaze never wavered. He knew he had to remain composed. There was work to be done. He carefully approached Mrs. Whitfield's body, noting the unnatural positioning of her limbs and the frozen grin that marred her otherwise peaceful features. The housekeeper had been a woman of routine, known for her impeccable service, and yet here she was, dead, with an expression of mirth that seemed almost mocking in its absurdity. The room had been thoroughly examined by the constables, but Harwick's eye for detail quickly picked up on things that others had missed. He noticed the torn velvet curtains, the shattered porcelain figurines, and the overturned furniture. But what caught his attention most was the faint, sweet odor that lingered in the air, a scent that seemed oddly familiar. He paused, his eyes narrowing as he processed the details. "There's something more to this," Harwick muttered under his breath. He wasn't just looking at a random act of violence. This wasn't the work of a typical killer. This was calculated. This was personal. Turning to one of the constables, Harwick asked, "What do we know about Mrs. Whitfield?" The constable, clearly rattled by the grisly scene, shook his head. "Nothing unusual, sir. She's been with the family for over 20 years. No known enemies, no bad blood. She was well-liked, especially among the staff." Harwick's gaze shifted back to the body. Her loyalty to the Harringtons couldn't have been the reason for her death. This is something else. He walked around the room, noting the subtle details. A carefully placed chair near the window, the position of the scattered books, the lack of struggle around the body. It was as though the killer had staged the scene, had set it up for a specific purpose. A signature, the smile, the laughter. In that moment, Harwick knew this wouldn't be an ordinary case. Whoever had done this was making a statement. This wasn't just about murder. It was about sending a message. With a final glance at the body, Harwick turned toward Lady Margaret, who was still visibly shaken. "I'll need to speak with the family, Lady Harrington. I'll be sure to keep you informed of any developments." Lady Margaret nodded, her eyes red-rimmed from the shock. "Please, Inspector, find who did this. We cannot live with this terror hanging over us." Harwick nodded, though in truth, he felt a heavy weight on his shoulders. The case had just begun, but already he could sense the darkness lurking beneath the surface of Belgravia's polished streets. As the investigation progressed, Harwick found himself entangled in a web of secrets and lies. No one in the wealthy district of Belgravia seemed willing to speak openly. The powerful families that lived there, including the Harringtons, controlled the city's social and political life. They were used to getting what they wanted, and they weren't about to let a simple murder tarnish their reputations. The more Harwick dug, the more he realized just how deep the connections went. The victims, Mrs. Whitfield included, weren't random. They were tied to a larger, more disturbing puzzle. A puzzle that Harwick wasn't sure he was ready to solve. But he had no choice. He had to follow the trail, no matter how dark it led. The killer's signature, the grotesque smile, the laughter, wasn't just a calling card. It was a warning. Harwick felt it in his bones. There was more to this than just murder. There was something deeper, something far more terrifying than anyone had anticipated. As Inspector Harwick continued his investigation, it became increasingly clear that these murders were not mere acts of violence, but something far more deliberate. Each victim, from Mrs. Whitfield to those who would follow, had been a part of something bigger. A connection was forming, one that led Harwick deep into the heart of London's theatrical community. The first clue came unexpectedly as Harwick reviewed the victim profiles. He noticed an unsettling pattern. Several of the victims, including Mrs. Whitfield, had all been involved in the cultural world of London in some way. Whether it was through attending exclusive theatrical performances or hosting intimate soirees with the city's elite, the arts had played a significant role in their lives. But it wasn't just the theater itself. There was something else, something darker, hidden beneath the curtains. Harwick's suspicions were confirmed when he learned about a secret society of intellectuals and performers who had gathered for private lectures, where the nature of human emotion, specifically, the authenticity of emotion in performance, was explored. These were no ordinary theatergoers. These were individuals deeply invested in the scientific study of emotions, those who believed that understanding human emotion could revolutionize society. Dr. Sebastian Hartwell, a former physician and now a prominent figure in the intellectual circles of London, had been one of the leading minds behind these discussions. His lectures, held in exclusive venues, focused on the idea that emotions like joy, terror, and sorrow were nothing more than social performances, masks worn to conform to societal expectations. The real, authentic emotional responses, Hartwell argued, could only be witnessed through extreme circumstances. He believed that the key to unlocking these raw emotions lay in chemistry. Harwick had heard of Dr. Hartwell before, but it wasn't until he began to dig deeper that he realized how closely the good doctor's theories were linked to the murders. Hartwell's obsession with the physical manifestations of emotions led him down a dangerous path, one that involved the use of chemical compounds designed to induce extreme emotional states. The irony was not lost on Harwick. The very thing Hartwell sought to study, genuine emotional reactions, was being forced upon the victims of these brutal crimes. Harwick's investigation led him to the West End, where Hartwell had frequented the finest theaters. It was in these high society settings that he had become a familiar figure, both respected and feared for his unorthodox theories and his relentless pursuit of the truth about human nature. But his theories didn't stop at mere academic discussions. They had become experiments, and those experiments were now taking lives. It was at the Lyceum Theatre, one of the most prestigious venues in London, that Harwick first encountered the strange behavior that would tie Hartwell to the victims. Several theater managers had reported a man, dressed in impeccable evening attire, who attended performances alone, sitting in the same box night after night. This man, who had become a regular fixture at the theater, had been known to laugh at the most inappropriate times. His laughter was not the polite chuckles of a cultured man enjoying a witty line, but rather the deep, unsettling laughter of someone lost in a fit of mania. One manager, Albert Grimby, had recalled that the man's laughter during the performances of Shakespeare's Macbeth had been particularly disturbing. Each time a death scene occurred, Lady Macbeth's descent into madness, the murder of Banquo, this man laughed. Not just a chuckle, but full-bodied, raucous laughter that filled the theater. At first, the patrons assumed it was a case of nervousness or eccentricity, but it soon became clear that the man's laughter was more than just a response to the play. It was as if he were experiencing something deeper, something darker than the performance itself. Grimby had asked the man to leave after several complaints from other patrons, but the man's reaction had been almost unervingly polite. He didn't seem offended by the request. Rather, he seemed to find the entire situation amusing. His response was simple, almost philosophical. "Your portrayal of mortality is so authentic, so full of life's absurdities. How could I not laugh?" The statement, though odd, stuck with Harwick. It was this particular individual's behavior that had sparked a troubling realization. This man, this strange patron, seemed to embody the very philosophy that Dr. Hartwell preached. The notion that emotion was an artificial performance, one that could be manipulated, was something that Harwick now saw reflected in the killer's actions. Harwick's next lead took him to Dr. Hartwell's private office, where he hoped to find more clues that would tie the doctor to the murders. What Harwick found was far more disturbing than he had anticipated. Hidden behind a false wall in Hartwell's study was a small laboratory, one filled with glass vials, chemical apparatus, and notebooks filled with meticulous notes. The documents chronicled experiments with various substances designed to manipulate human emotion. Hartwell had been developing compounds that could induce states of pure joy, deep terror, and overwhelming sorrow, emotions that were typically suppressed by society's expectations. Harwick's heart raced as he read through the notebooks. The experiments were chilling in their precision. The goal, it seemed, was to create an authentic emotional experience, one that would allow the subject to experience raw, unfiltered emotions. And in some cases, these emotions had been so extreme that they led to death. But it wasn't just the physical compounds that were disturbing. As Harwick read further, he discovered that Hartwell had been using members of London's intellectual and artistic circles as unwitting subjects in these experiments. The connections between the victims and Hartwell's lectures were undeniable. Mrs. Whitfield, as it turned out, had attended one of Hartwell's secret lectures months before her death. So had Geoffrey Kendish, the young heir to the tea-importing dynasty. The more Harwick uncovered, the clearer it became. The killer wasn't just taking lives. He was using them as part of a twisted scientific experiment. Each victim was chosen not just for their status, but for their interest in the philosophy that Hartwell espoused. The Laughing Man, as he was now being called, was not a madman on a killing spree. He was part of a larger, more disturbing scheme, one that would continue as long as Dr. Hartwell's experiments remained unchallenged. Harwick had known that the case was more than it seemed from the beginning, but now, he faced a terrifying new reality. The killer's motivations were rooted not in madness, but in a chilling desire to experiment with the very essence of human emotion. As the investigation into the murders deepened, Inspector Harwick began to realize that the case was becoming far more complex than he had originally anticipated. The clues were leading him in multiple directions, but each path seemed to circle back to one central figure, Dr. Sebastian Hartwell. The enigmatic intellectual had, for all intents and purposes, vanished from public view after his lectures had ended, but his shadow loomed large over every new lead Harwick uncovered. It wasn't just the chemicals or the experiments that troubled Harwick. It was the underlying philosophy that seemed to fuel them. Hartwell's theories were rooted in a cold, clinical view of human nature. He saw emotions as nothing more than societal performances, masks that people wore to conform to expectations. Hartwell believed that true emotional expression could only be achieved in the most extreme conditions, when a person's body was pushed to the absolute limit of physical and mental endurance. The laughter, the smiles frozen on the faces of the victims, were not just random acts of madness. They were an attempt to capture a moment of raw emotional authenticity. To Hartwell, these extreme states of emotional release were the key to unlocking the truth of human existence. And for him, there was no greater pursuit than that. The turning point came when Harwick finally gained access to one of Hartwell's private lectures, held at a secluded venue just outside the city. The lecture was a gathering of high-profile intellectuals, performers, and scientists, all drawn to the idea of unlocking the deepest, most primal emotions. They had gathered to discuss the concept of emotional authenticity, the idea that society's conventions suppressed the most genuine aspects of human feeling. Harwick attended the lecture undercover, posing as a potential donor for Hartwell's experimental projects. As he entered the dimly lit room, filled with the low murmur of conversation and the scent of tobacco smoke, Harwick could immediately feel the weight of the atmosphere. There was an almost palpable sense of reverence in the air, a sense that this was a space where the boundaries of conventional morality and intellectual inquiry were being stretched to their limits. Dr. Hartwell stood at the front of the room, speaking in measured tones, his hands gesturing as he explained the delicate balance between fear, joy, and sorrow. He spoke of the chemical experiments he had been conducting, detailing the ways in which certain compounds could enhance the body's natural response to stimuli. His theories had gained a small but influential following among those who believed that emotional expression was being stifled by society's rules. Imagine, Hartwell said, his voice low and hypnotic, a world where people could experience their emotions freely, without the constraints of social norms. No longer would we be bound by the conventions of politeness or propriety. We would be free to experience true joy, true sorrow, the power to experience life as it was meant to be experienced, without fear of judgment. Harwick listened intently, his mind racing. Hartwell's words seemed to reverberate through the room, weaving a web of intellectual and emotional seduction. To many in the room, this philosophy had become an obsession. They weren't just interested in the theoretical. They wanted to experience it, to feel the emotions Hartwell spoke of in their purest form, and for this they were willing to pay the price. It was then that Harwick noticed something strange. A man in the front row who seemed to be oddly fixated on the proceedings. He was tall, with pale features, and his eyes gleamed with a strange intensity as he watched Hartwell speak. The man's expression shifted as Hartwell spoke about the dangers of stifled emotion. He smiled, a slow, deliberate grin that seemed to stretch too far, as though it were impossible for him to contain his excitement. The realization hit Harwick like a cold wave. This man wasn't just a follower of Hartwell's philosophy, he was living it. And his smile? It wasn't just a reaction to the lecture. It was the same twisted grin that had appeared on the faces of the victims. Harwick knew then that the killer had been sitting in that very room, perhaps even taking part in these discussions. This man, this strange patron who had laughed at the theater, had been drawn to Hartwell's philosophy of emotional authenticity, and now he was living out those beliefs by manipulating and inducing extreme emotions in his victims. His murders weren't senseless acts of violence. They were experiments just like Hartwell's. Harwick's mind began to piece the puzzle together. The killer wasn't just trying to destroy the lives of the victims. He was forcing them to experience emotions at their most extreme: sorrow, terror, joy, emotions that could only be truly felt when they were stripped of their societal masks. The victims' last moments were their most authentic, their most real. But there was something even more chilling about the killer's philosophy. The more Harwick thought about it, the clearer it became. The murderer wasn't just interested in the emotions of his victims. He was also deeply fascinated by their death, the final, ultimate release from the performance of life. To the killer, death wasn't the end. It was the peak of the emotional experience, the moment when all societal constructs were erased and the person could be free. Harwick's heart raced as the weight of the killer's motivations became clear. This wasn't just a case of madness. It was a deep-seated belief system, one that had been nurtured by Hartwell's toxic philosophy. The killer was driven by the idea that true emotion could only be experienced when one was pushed to the edge of existence. And death was the ultimate emotional release. With this knowledge, Harwick's focus shifted. The case was no longer just about catching a murderer. It was about stopping an ideological movement. A movement that could potentially spread if left unchecked. Harwick had to stop this man before he could take the next life in pursuit of his twisted philosophy. As Harwick left the lecture hall, he knew the road ahead would be fraught with danger. The killer was not just a maniac. He was someone with a purpose, someone who believed in his cause. And if Harwick didn't act quickly, more lives would be lost to the killer's twisted vision of emotional purity. The night was colder than usual, with a biting wind that cut through the streets of London, making the fog feel even more oppressive. Inspector Harwick stood before the dilapidated theater, its once pristine facade now cloaked in shadows. The Lyceum Theater had long since closed its doors to the public, but tonight, it was the scene of a final confrontation that had been brewing for months. Harwick had followed the clues, pieced together the connections, and come to a terrifying conclusion. The killer had returned to the place where it all began. The city's gaslights flickered in the distance, casting long, trembling shadows on the cobblestone streets. Harwick's heart beat in time with the rhythm of his footsteps as he approached the old building. He had been here once before, tracking the elusive man who had laughed at the theater. But now he wasn't chasing shadows. He was coming to the heart of the storm. Inside, the theater was eerily silent. The usual hum of voices and the rustle of programs had been replaced by the soft creak of the floorboards beneath Harwick's boots. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of stale velvet hung in the air. It was as though the theater itself had been waiting for this final act to play out. Harwick's breath came out in shallow bursts as he made his way up the grand staircase. The old building was a labyrinth of corridors and forgotten rooms, but Harwick knew exactly where he was going. He had received a tip-off, a final message from the killer, an invitation to meet in the heart of the theater, where the curtains would rise one last time. The door to the private box at the back of the theater creaked open. Harwick stepped inside, his eyes scanning the dimly lit room. There, sitting in the same chair where the killer had once watched a performance, was the man who had haunted his every step. Dr. Sebastian Hartwell. The doctor looked up from his seat, his face pale under the flickering light. His once impeccable attire was now wrinkled, his hair unkempt, and his eyes. Those eyes were full of something that Harwick couldn't quite place. They were wild, almost manic, as if the doctor had finally reached the apex of his twisted journey. "I knew you would come, Inspector," Hartwell said, his voice a low murmur that echoed through the empty theater. "I've been waiting for this moment." Harwick took a step forward, his hand instinctively reaching for his revolver, though he knew he wouldn't need it. This wasn't a confrontation that could be solved by force. No, this was the culmination of months of investigation, a battle of wits, of ideals. The killer, who had once hidden in the shadows, had finally revealed himself. "You've been behind it all, haven't you?" Harwick asked, his voice steady but with an edge of disbelief. "The murders, the experiments, it was all part of your twisted philosophy." Hartwell's smile widened, though it lacked the warmth of a genuine grin. "Twisted? No, Inspector. I've only sought the truth. Do you not see? I've given them the gift of authenticity, the purest form of emotional release that the world could offer. I've freed them from their bonds, from the constraints of society." Harwick stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "And you think that justifies murder? You think that forcing people into terror and madness is some kind of gift?" Hartwell stood up slowly, his hands shaking as he gestured toward the empty seats. "You can't understand it, Inspector. No one can. I've spent my life seeking the rawest, truest emotions, the ones that society suppresses. The laughter, the fear, the grief, the real emotions. I've given my victims the chance to be free, to experience life as it truly is. By killing them?" Harwick's voice was colder now, a harsh edge of finality in his words. "By making them suffer? You are a murderer, Hartwell. You're not some philosopher or visionary. You're a madman." Hartwell's eyes flared, his voice rising in a fevered pitch. "A madman? You think I'm mad? No, Inspector. I've simply seen the truth. The world is full of masks, of false smiles, of pretensions. But my victims were given the gift of authenticity. They were freed from the charade. They died in the most honest way possible, by feeling everything, by experiencing the full depth of human emotion." He took a step toward Harwick, his voice trembling with fervor. "Don't you see? The world is blind. They've all been living a lie, hiding behind their masks. I've shown them the truth, in its purest form." Harwick stood motionless, his mind racing. He had heard madness before, but this was something far more terrifying. Hartwell wasn't just a man driven by insanity. He was someone who believed, with every fiber of his being, that his actions were justified. He had crafted a worldview so warped, so detached from reality, that he couldn't see the monstrousness of what he had done. With a cold, measured voice, Harwick finally spoke. "You're not a liberator, Hartwell. You're a killer. You've destroyed lives in the name of your philosophy, and I won't let you destroy any more." Hartwell's expression faltered for a moment, but his smile quickly returned. He stepped back, almost as if inviting Harwick to take the final step into the abyss. "You can try to stop me, Inspector, but the truth is already out, and there are others who will follow. The seed has been planted." Harwick shook his head, taking one final, decisive step forward. "No, your madness ends here." And with that, the final act was played out. Harwick, with grim determination, arrested Dr. Hartwell, bringing an end to the reign of terror that had gripped London's elite. But even as the killer was led away, Harwick couldn't shake the feeling that this was not the end. The seeds of Hartwell's philosophy had been planted in the minds of others. The question remained, how many would follow in his footsteps? As Harwick sat alone in his office, the weight of the case began to settle in. It had been days since Dr. Sebastian Hartwell's arrest, and the city was slowly beginning to breathe again. The murders, the terror, the twisted philosophy that had driven them, it was all over. The streets of London, once thick with fog and fear, now seemed quieter. The shadows no longer felt so oppressive. But for Harwick, the relief was bittersweet. The finality of the case had not brought him the peace he had hoped for. He had caught the killer, exposed the man behind the laughter, but the implications of Hartwell's philosophy lingered in his mind. He had never encountered a criminal like Hartwell, someone so deeply convinced of his righteousness, someone who believed, without hesitation, that the suffering of others was justified in the pursuit of truth. As Harwick sat at his desk, his fingers drumming lightly against the wooden surface, he couldn't help but reflect on the lives lost. The victims, each one a casualty in a twisted experiment. The young heiress, the dedicated housekeeper, the famous theater director, each had been plucked from their lives, forced to experience the rawest emotions before they were taken. Their deaths had been horrific, but it wasn't just the murders that haunted Harwick. It was the knowledge that their final moments had been stolen from them, manipulated by Hartwell in his relentless pursuit of a warped ideal. Harwick had known that the truth would eventually come to light. He had uncovered the connection between the murders and Hartwell's philosophical beliefs. But the killer's motives, the very idea that someone could justify murder in the name of understanding human emotion, left Harwick with an unsettling feeling. How many others, hidden in the shadows of London's elite, shared Hartwell's beliefs? How many would be inspired by his vision? The seed had been planted, and though Hartwell had been caught, Harwick knew that the ideology would not simply disappear. The city had seen many criminals in its time, but none quite like Hartwell. The doctor wasn't just a murderer. He was a product of a society that had long valued appearance over substance, that had lived by the rules of propriety while suppressing the most primal aspects of human existence. Hartwell had seen the truth where others had closed their eyes. He had pushed the boundaries of human emotion, but at what cost? And what about the future? Could the intellectual circles of London, with their thirst for knowledge and understanding, be so easily seduced by the allure of Hartwell's ideas? Harwick didn't have the answers. He could only hope that the darkness Hartwell had unleashed would not find fertile ground in the hearts of others. As the days passed, the press moved on. The story of the Laughing Man became another chapter in London's long history of scandal and intrigue. The case was closed, but its shadow loomed large over the city. Harwick had done his duty, had brought an end to the terror. But as he walked through the quiet streets of London late one evening, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this story. A deeper, more insidious undercurrent that had yet to be fully understood. The finality of Hartwell's capture did not bring Harwick the sense of triumph he had expected. Instead, it left him with a lingering unease, an awareness that the pursuit of truth, no matter how noble it may seem, could often lead down paths far darker than one could ever imagine. The doctor had sought to reveal the truth of human emotion, to strip away the masks of society and witness the rawest parts of the human soul. But in the end, Harwick understood that some truths were better left hidden. As he gazed out over the foggy streets of London, Harwick couldn't help but wonder, how many other truths remained buried in the shadows, waiting for someone to come along and expose them? And would anyone be willing to pay the price for that knowledge? The laughter had stopped. The killer had been caught. But the echoes of his twisted philosophy would forever remain in the corners of the city. A reminder that sometimes, the pursuit of truth could cost more than anyone was willing to pay. Before we end tonight's tale, I want to thank you once again for joining us in the grave of the shadows. Your support means the world to us. If you've enjoyed this chilling mystery, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss another spine-tingling story. But we want to hear from you. What do you think? Do you believe Dr. Hartwell's philosophy had any merit? Or was he just a man lost in madness? Could there be others out there, hiding in the shadows, who share his dangerous ideas? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to know your theories, your opinions, or any suggestions for future investigations. And if you enjoyed the story, be sure to share it with your friends who love mysteries as much as you do. Is there a case that you think we should cover next? A mystery that's been unsolved for too long? Let us know. We're always on the lookout for the next great mystery to uncover. And don't forget, stay curious. The world is full of shadows, secrets, and stories waiting to be discovered. Until next time, keep your lights dimmed, your mind sharp, and your curiosity alive. Thanks for watching and good night.